Hello, welcome back to Reviving History. This week's episode will be about the Franklin Nashville campaign and the fall of John Bell Hood. The campaign has interested me for many years because Hood himself is such a fascinating figure. Before he took command of the Army of Tennessee, he commanded nothing more than a division, and then all of a sudden he was thrusted into commanding arguably the worst and most corrupt army in the war. On top of that, he was facing arguably one of the best generals in American history, Sherman. I originally wanted to do an episode on Sherman's March to the Sea, but there's already hundreds of different podcasts, videos, and documentaries on the subject. So I decided that I wanted to talk about Hood, who faced Sherman and tried to counter his march to the sea. His attempted campaign north into Tennessee to rally support and manpower answers the question whether Hood is a good general or an example of the Peter Principle. Hood, a once young and ambitious soldier, found himself missing an arm and a leg for a lost cause. The once proud armies of the Confederacy were suffering defeat after defeat, with the Union making massive territorial gains deep into the southern heartland. The Confederacy was low on equipment, food, and manpower. Poor Southern administration and bureaucratic incompetence plagued the Army of Tennessee. The Confederate Army in the West. For the majority of the war, the Army suffered constant defeat and corrupt leadership. This was commonplace. There was also varying loyalties between each regiment within the Army of Tennessee, making sectionalism rule. In 1863, Confederate General James Longstreet was sent out to assist General Braxton Bragg. Together, they were able to achieve local tactical superiority and deliver a crushing blow to the Union at Chickamauga. This deeply disturbed Grant. He and Sherman alike feared that attacks like this would become commonplace the deeper they went south. In spite of this victory, Bragg was replaced by Joseph E. Johnston. Bragg was taken off the field and placed in Jefferson Davis's cabinet as Secretary of War, a promotion, even though he lost Tennessee and failed to follow up the victory of Chickamauga. By spring of 1864, Sherman had around 120,000 men versus Johnston's 60,000. Johnston planned to grind Sherman down, fighting him every step of the way, bringing him deeper and deeper into Georgia. Johnston's men had the home field advantage, with nothing but mountains, forests, swamps, and rivers in between Johnston and Sherman. Being on the defensive and waiting patiently for Sherman to make a mistake was Johnston's plan. This was exactly the opposite of what the politicians in Richmond wanted Johnston to do. They wanted Johnston to go into attack and somehow drive Sherman out of Georgia and then out of Tennessee. Johnston had his men take defensive positions along a couple miles of stone and clay, named the Rocky Face Ridge, and then he had his men garrison another ridge called the Buzzard's Roost. This was extremely defensible positions. Sherman knew better than to just attack head-on and simply moved around Johnston, like Grant with Lee during the Overland Campaign. Sherman ordered a pincer movement around the ridges to hit the rail line behind the ridges that ran from Atlanta to Dalton. Johnston withdrew, being forced to retreat to Resac, southward of Dalton. Johnston ordered Hood and Hardee to maneuver and wait for an opportunity to catch one of the three armies that Sherman was commanding, but he was not able to catch any of them in a movement or catch them in a favorable position to attack. Johnston moved to the small railway town of Resaca, where he set up defenses and waited for Sherman. Sherman attacked Johnston, but was repulsed, with Hood spearheading the counterattack. Even after this tactical defeat, Sherman maneuvered once again, causing Johnston to leave Resaca. Sherman's plan worked, but he was taking heavy losses, with him losing 3,375 men at Resaca compared to the Confederates only losing 170 men. During this attritional withdrawal, Johnston was somehow spreading discontent among the ranks of his own men. Hood started writing to his new friend Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. Hood and Davis would become friends during Hood's recovery after Chickamauga. Hood would be almost a spy for Davis and would write detailed letters on how Johnston was losing too much ground, with Sherman already halfway to Atlanta with no major battles fought. Hood lobbied that he could do better, that he was a student of Jackson and Lee, and that he was going to be able to deliver a crushing blow if he had the chance and drive Sherman out of Georgia, out of Tennessee, and win the war. This is obviously a tall order. These letters from Hood made Davis start thinking about a change of leadership, with Hood taking charge. Davis feared that Johnston was going to even retreat past Atlanta, leaving the city to its fate. Regardless, Johnston reached the outskirts of Atlanta, where he decided to make a stand on Kenshall Mountain, the only possible defensive position near the city. Sherman decided to take Kenshall Mountain with a total assault on its defenses. This battle would turn into a spectacular failure, with Sherman being thrown off the mountain. That would be the last time Sherman would attack a fortified position, even if he outnumbered the Confederates 2-1. It just simply wasn't working. Attacking defensive positions would be commonplace among this campaign, and it just never worked. It's almost like a prelude to World War I, so Sherman, after Kennesaw Mountain, gathered his forces and maneuvered again, this time towards the city of Atlanta. Johnson tried to make a stand on the Chattahoochee River, but Sherman simply just went around him by moving on his right with McPherson's army. Johnson once again retreated, and this time he knew he was in trouble and wired for help from Richmond. Davis was livid. How could Johnson lose this much ground without fighting a set battle? So Davis decided that the only man for the job was Hood, who was writing to Davis for weeks about how he could do better. Hood got his chance. Why Hood, you might ask? By this point in the war, he was missing an arm and a leg. He never commanded anything bigger than a division in his prime. He was a courageous leader and fighter, but beyond that, there was little to say for his qualifications. Bragg will go on to say that Hood was not a man of genius or a great general, but far better than anyone else. Lee would say Hood is a bold fighter, but I am doubtful to the other qualities necessary. Before we focus on the Battle of Atlanta itself, I want to discuss the formidable years of John Bell Hood. Hood's family came from the old aristocratic European elite. His family had been in America since the early 1600s. Originally, the Hoods were from Virginia, but moved to Kentucky after the American Revolution. Like many Americans, they moved out to Kentucky because the land was so dirt cheap. So everyone moved out there, and then within a generation, massive estates were created there. By the mid-19th century, the Hood family owned hundreds of acres of land and dozens of slaves. Hood's father was not Virginian elite, but he was definitely adjacent to it. Hood's father was able to implement his political allies and send his son to West Point. Hood struggled at West his 4 years at the academy and finished at the bottom of his class. Once Hood graduated, he was sent out west to California. His stay in California was brief. He arrived at the height of the gold rush, and inflation forced Hood and his fellow officers to live off the land and even grow their own food and sell at market to pay for their cost of living. The only other notable event that happened in California was that Hood and Sherman had a brief encounter. Hood was then sent to Texas shortly after, where he served under Robert E. Lee on cavalry patrols. Hood always saw Lee as a father figure, ever since their time they spent together at West Point, where they first met. Lee gave Hood valuable life advice, which stuck with Hood throughout his life. During one random patrol, Hood was leading a group of around 50 cavalrymen and got ambushed by Native Americans. The fighting was short and violent. After the short skirmish, both sides took defensive positions and waited till nightfall, with both sides withdrawing. Hood would leave Texas once the succession began. He first went to Kentucky to meet with the governor. During a brief conversation, Hood figured out that his home state actually was going to remain neutral and not get involved in the conflict. So Hood decided to go down to Mobile, Alabama, the original Confederate capital, to get a command. And then he moved to Richmond, once, the Confederates had moved the capital to Richmond shortly after. Once at Richmond, Hood was put in charge of Texans, due to him spending a majority of his career out west, and a lot of it in Texas. Hood was responsible for training and equipping the Texans. During his time, while he was, training his force, his responsibility and rank rapidly increased. Right before the Peninsula Campaign, Hood was promoted to Brigadier General. Hood fought in all the major early battles of the war. Hood would later be mentored under Stonewall Jackson and Lee, who gave him on-the-job crash course training in maneuver warfare. At Gettysburg, Hood committed his men up the heights of Devil's Den and got severely wounded, losing his arm while commanding the attack. Hood was sent home for a short respite, but lost all feeling in his arm, and it never worked again. Hood would serve under Longstreet at Chickamauga, where he lost his leg while leading from the front. Hood then was sent home, where he briefly got engaged, and then was transferred to the Army of Tennessee. The notable battles Hood served in was Gaines' Mill, Antietam, and Gettysburg, along with Chickamauga. In the future, I might do a full biography on Hood, so I didn't really want to get into too much detail on the individual battles that he served in. To continue, Hood's fate was sealed, and the Army of Tennessee was livid at Hood's promotion, with men deserting en masse. They believed Hood was too young. He was only 32 at the time. Senior leadership felt passed over and enraged. Hood was even surprised by this promotion himself. He desperately tried to salvage the situation and went to Johnson's tent, begging him to save the city of Atlanta. Johnson, who was packing up his belongings, said along the lines of, "Sure, kid," and then he ran off into the countryside, never to be heard from again, leaving Hood to just defend the city. And Hood didn't even know where most of the corps were. Like half his army, only Johnson knew where the soldiers were. So he was like, good luck, kid. You want to be in charge? Here you go. And he just left. Hood immediately took command and decided to try to hit Sherman before Sherman hit him. Hood decided to attack Sherman's right, where 50,000 Union soldiers were spread out. Hood planned to drive the Union back into Breacher's Creek. He wanted to hit a small, isolated part of the army, driving them into the river. Hood wanted to be on the offensive instead of defending earthworks. Hood despised defensive positions, thinking them to be cowardly. Hood committed 2/3 of his army and attacked in force, but the battle failed. orders got mixed up, and the attack launched several hours later than it should have. General Thomas, aka the Rock of Chickamauga, was able to hold Hood back, who attacked 5 separate times to no avail. The only thing the Battle of Peachers Creek accomplished was making Sherman tighten his lines. The following day, Hood pulled back to a tighter defensive line and ordered Hardee's Corps on a 12-hour night march around Sherman's left flank. Hood wanted Hardee to attack at dawn, but instead, Hardee attacked at noon. Now, this would be commonplace for a lot of the campaigns that Hood would command, that he would plan these ambitious flanking movements, but he was never able to execute it. And stuff like this would just keep happening. And I think this is one of the reasons why Hood failed in the end, is that he was never on the pulse of his corps commanders. All the attacks, all the planning never panned out because he was never there. It was so painful for him to ride his horse that he could only command from paper. Like Stonewall Jackson, for example, he would do his own scouting. I mean, that's how he got killed. But every time he did want to execute a plan, he would be in the vicinity, and Hood never was. The attack almost worked, though, with Hardee's Corps, but Sherman's men again held the field, firing from defensive works and using artillery as cover, devastating the assaulting Confederates, who took some ground on fortifications but were inevitably thrown back. 8,000 Confederates lay dead, and nothing was gained but the loss of more vital Confederate manpower. The following week, nothing happened but silence. Hood figured correctly that Sherman was moving men right to the Macon Railroad that supplied Atlanta. Hood ordered General Stephen Lee to counter and set an ambush, then hold out till A.P. Stewart's corps arrived, who would attack on an unsuspected flank. Lee failed to follow Hood's orders and blindly stumbled into the Union, getting into a savage brawl. With the third and final attack over, Hood ordered his men to retire to the defenses of Atlanta. Sherman then moved his army, leaving the defenses of his city, and attacked the railroad in force. With the fall of the Macon Railroad, Atlanta was lost. Hood left the city as Sherman marched in. With the city occupied, Sherman ordered Atlanta to be evacuated, saying, "War is cruelty, not a popularity contest." Hood and Sherman then rode to each other, trying to bait each other in open combat almost. Sherman blamed Hood personally for the whole war, while Hood called Sherman an honorless war criminal. Eventually, they organized a truce, and the people of Atlanta left the city. I don't even know this letter exchange of them trash-talking each other. I wanted to put some of it in for this episode, but it's just too rambly. I think, Sherman was just mad at Hood, and then Hood was really mad that he lost the city of Atlanta, so they just went at it. Hood decided to move his army north to Palmetto, Georgia, to set a new base of operations. Hood planned on cutting Sherman's supply lines north of him in an attempt to starve him out of the city. This plan obviously wouldn't work. Sherman retroactively planned for his men to live off the land and had ideas of marching to the sea. After all, they are in one of the most fertile regions in the South. Why then did Hood plan this operation? First off, Hood wanted to drive Sherman from the city of Atlanta. If he couldn't do it militarily, he would then try to cut off the railway lines and starve him out. Armies quickly ate up supplies in any region they were in. So after a couple days of occupying the city, Sherman would be forced to move south to search for food. Hood then would swing down and attempt to hit the foraging armies in detail. This plan made sense. Hood had been driven from the field multiple times, and it would be useless to just keep attacking. Jefferson Davis arrived to meet Hood and to approve of the general's plan. He also wanted to review Hood's poorly equipped and supplied army. Hood had around 45,000 men, and they were ready for this offensive up north. Hood marched north at 3 different places and went to work immediately taking apart railways and attacking small garrisons and outposts. Hood ordered that the vital junction of Altoona be taken due to rumors of a large food cache. Sherman sent men north in case of that scenario. Sherman sent Brigadier John M. Corse in defense of the railway junction. Sherman also gathered his men and marched north himself personally to try to save the railway hub. Hood sent General John French to take the railway depot, and at first, French's attack looked like it was successful. He overran the defenses and sent to work burning the supplies. In French's after-action report, he said that it was apparently too damp in the warehouse and that the matches would not light in time when he intercepted orders from Sherman that said, "Hold on, I'm coming." Now, French did not want to get caught between 2 massive forces, so he decided to withdraw. French lost 25% of his men during the fighting, and Corse lost 35%. Hood then withdrew and vanished. Sherman was livid. He could not defend the endless miles of track with Nathan Bedford Forrest, Hood, and Joseph Wheeler ripping up tracks at all different places hundreds of miles apart. Sherman asked for permission to destroy his own railway line himself and just march to the sea, freeing himself from such a vast and impossible defensive line. Sherman never got an answer from Grant, though, when he requested this. The telegraph lines were cut. Hood quickly marched west around Rome, Georgia, and then went through the Chattanooga River Valley. The next day, he appeared at Resaca, surprising the Union garrison. Hood sent the commander of the Union garrison a threatening letter saying that Hood would not take any prisoners. The commander replied, "If you're not going to take any prisoners, then try to come and take the fort." Hood's bluff failed spectacularly. Frustrated by his failed bluff, he moved north, not wanting to lose vital manpower on storming the fort. During this time, P.T. Beauregard arrived to join Hood as an advisor. Beauregard spoke better French than English and spent the war wandering the Confederacy in search of glory, fighting in all theaters. Davis found Beauregard frustrating and sent him to join Hood just to get him out of Richmond for a while. Beauregard and Hood were kindred spirits. Both had overly ambitious plans on defeating the North. Hood told Beauregard that he planned on destroying as much railway lines as possible to try to bait Sherman into engaging him. If that did not happen, Hood would just simply chase after Sherman. The Confederates continued their march north to Dalton, walking over the old battlefields they previously fought on. There were still skeletons of horses and men alike that covered the roads, haunting the men as they walked by. Once they reached Dalton, they ordered the surrender of the Union garrison. This time, they surrendered. Unfortunately, the commander foolishly decided to surrender instead of fighting. The Union garrison, occupied by African Americans, who once were captured, were enslaved and put to work taking up railway lines. During this time, they spotted Sherman, who was hunting them. Hood and Beauregard wanted to fight, but that the division commanders said that their men were not ready for a pitched fight with Sherman. Their army was still demoralized after the fall of Atlanta. Hood considered building a defensive line and waiting for Sherman to attack. But that also wouldn't work. Sherman would just repair the railroad that they just ripped apart and wait for reinforcements, attacking only when they had enough men, or Sherman would simply just maneuver around, smashing into Hood's flank. Hood and Beauregard hit the drawing board and decided on a grand odyssey to end the war. They planned to march north into Tennessee, taking Union installations while also gathering thousands of new recruits from these northern states, forging a new army. Then they would march into the neighboring states and rinse, repeat. After they gathered enough men, they would march through Pennsylvania and then attack Grant from behind. Once they defeated Grant, they would merge armies with General Lee and march to D.C., ending the war. This plan was, to say the least, ambitious, and didn't take into account Sherman, who would be free to march through the southern heartland. Hood moved into Alabama, losing Sherman, who gave up on the chase, believing it not to be worth it. Sherman sent men north to guard key installations and depots and went back to lobbying D.C. for his march to the sea. During this time, Jefferson Davis tried to order Hood back into Georgia to defend against Sherman. P.T. Beauregard defended Hood's plan, stating that the Georgia militia could defend against Sherman, which is obviously false. The Georgia militia would be only made up of the very old and the very young, and couldn't possibly defend against Sherman if the regular army couldn't. Around the same time, Abraham Lincoln won re-election, ending any possibility of ending the war earlier. Abraham Lincoln would prosecute the war to the finish, and the Confederacy was doomed. Grant was at Richmond, and Sherman was ready to be unchained on the southern heartland. It was over for the South. Sherman sat at the Alabama-Georgia border, hopelessly bored, waiting for permission to march to the sea. Sherman, after chasing Hood, just believed it was useless. Hood would be way too fast. Sherman wrote to everyone with any modicum of authority to try to get his permission to march to the sea. Eventually, Grant, after personally reviewing Sherman's situation, gave the blessing for Sherman to march off to the sea. But before Sherman left, Sherman decided to destroy the railway lines that he would use for supplies. He decided to destroy them to prevent them from being, raided. And then he cut his telephone lines, cutting them off from the world. Then he sent George Thomas north to Nashville to counter Hood, sending with him the sick and wounded, along with other regiments that Sherman believed would be ineffective on his march to the sea. Hood had waited a month in the Alabama-Tennessee border to sneak past the Union gunboats to cross the vital Tennessee River. Cold weather would attrition his army and put Hood in a really tenuous situation. Hood would wait till he received help from Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who by this point in the war was a Confederate legend and war criminal. Hood and Forrest finally regrouped after a month of waiting, and they crossed the Tennessee River. Once he crossed, Hood saw a portion of Thomas's army marching to Nashville, under the command of General Schofield. Hood decided that he would try an attempt to get between Schofield and Nashville. Schofield was slightly outnumbered by Hood, so Hood saw an opportunity for an easy victory. Hood would cross north over the Duck River and try to engage Schofield. Hood attacked in tandem with Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would engage the Union cavalry. Hood attacked Set Piece and failed to defeat the isolated Union army. General Schofield was able to hold off Hood's attacks as more of Hood's force flooded in. The Confederate order of battle was completely messed up, with Hood's planned flank attack failing. Once night fell on the battlefield, Hood suddenly ordered his men to halt the attack, waiting until morning to resume the fighting. Right as the battle truly began, Hood checked out. Of course, Schofield used this sudden stop in the fighting to withdraw to Franklin, in complete eyesight of Hood's camp that failed to press the attack. Literally, Union troops were marching past Hood's army while they slept. This caused many historians to raise the question, what the hell happened? Some suggest that Hood was drunk or high because of the nerve pain that he lost when he lost his leg. The surgeon that took Hood's leg off took it right off on the thigh, and it still hurt nearly a year later. To lead on horseback, Hood would have to be tied on his horse, so he didn't just fall off. Just the simple task of riding caused Hood great pain. Obviously, Hood shouldn't have been in command. He spent most of the Battle of Spring Hill bedridden in agony at his headquarters from the day of endless riding. He would plan something ambitious like Jackson or Lee, but never follow up with it because he could not lead his men. Hood truly had an opportunity to defeat Schofield and cause serious alarm to the Union high command. The next morning, to only Hood's surprise, Schofield was gone. Hood then blamed his officers at breakfast, but the defeat rested on Hood's shoulders alone. Hood ordered the pursuit of Schofield. Schofield had no cavalry because they were scattered after the devastating charge led by Forrest. Schofield sent word to George Thomas to fix the bridges at Franklin so he could quickly march past, escape, and head to Nashville. Thomas never got the request, so once Schofield reached Franklin, he had to rebuild the bridges to get across. A note arrived at Schofield's headquarters from Thomas later on the day asking if he could hold on for 3 more days. Schofield quickly replied, "I don't know if I could hold on for 3 more hours." For the rest of the morning, Schofield was preparing for the inevitable showdown. Schofield decided on making a ring of earthworks around the small town of Franklin. He ordered trees, doors, and roofs, and even a whole cotton gin to be torn down to help in the defenses. Hood approached the battlefield from 3 separate directions, making short work of the last detachments of Schofield's army that were fighting a rear guard to Franklin. Around 11, Confederate cavalry under Forrest caught up with the rear of the Union army at Winstead Hill. An hour-long skirmish developed. The Union held out, and then after the arrival of A.P. Stewart's corps, forced the Union to withdraw under General Wagner. Hood arrived feeling slightly better, but was still driven by rage by the missed opportunity of the night prior. Hood surveyed Winstead Hill and noticed the earthworks at Franklin. The earthworks were 3 lines deep and filled with men. Hood could not see from his position on Winstead Hill that Schofield actually had 3 lines. He only saw the first 2. Now, this would be very important later in the battle. Around 4 p.m., Hood decided that he would have his men storm the earthworks on all sides. All of Hood's generals were against this plan, believing it to be too costly. They all hated frontal assaults. They believed it never worked, which they were kind of right. Forrest suggested, "Give me 1 strong division of infantry with my cavalry, and within 2 hours' time, I will agree to the Federals' flank and drive them from their works." Now, this is very ambitious, and Hood declined, wanting to fight the Union at Franklin, where they were, and not attempt anything fancy. Hood stated to his generals, "I would prefer to fight them here, where they are, where they've only had 8 hours to fortify, than strike them at Nashville, where they've been strengthening their defenses for 3 years or more." Hood's generals still felt burned by Forrest's dressing down that morning at breakfast, so they are like, "All right, Hood, if this is your plan, that's it. They're not going to fight for his career." Hood's army rushed forward around 4 under the cover of fog and formed up right before the first line, taking it. Wagner held the first line, and his men quickly routed and ran towards the second redoubt, the main redoubt. They ran towards the center, and the Confederates used the retreating Union soldiers as human shields, screaming, "Go into the earthworks with them." On the Confederate left, there were no human shields to protect the Confederate advance. The heavy Union fire devastated the Confederate lines. A blizzard of musket balls and canister shots flew into the advancing Confederates, killing many senior officers that were indispensable to Hood. In spite of this Confederate assault failing, the center broke through. Ironically, Todd Carter of the 20th Tennessee would be killed during the fighting, assaulting the grounds of his childhood home. Around the Carter house was the center of the fighting. The third line of reserves, that I said would be important later, rushed forward to the center to try to plug in the gaps that the Confederates were able to briefly make in the Union line. The Carter House would be the center of the fighting, with Confederates stubbornly holding on to the small portion of redoubts that they were able to take. Hood ordered in his reserves to reinforce the left flank around 7, but they were utterly repulsed. Around 9, the attacks ended, and the remnants of Hood's force withdrew back to their lines. The battle was a spectacular failure for the Confederates, and would be later known as one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The only other fight to compare this to is Pickett's Charge. Matter of fact, the Battle of Franklin is nicknamed Pickett's Charge of the West. The Charge of Franklin was far worse than Pickett's Charge, with the Confederates marching 1.5 miles on an open field to reach the Union lines instead of just a mile at Gettysburg. The only reason why the Confederates suffered around the same casualties as Pickett's Charge is due to the cover of fog and the Confederates using the Union troops as human shields as they retreated to the center line. Hood lost around 7,000 men, while Pickett's Charge they lost around 6,500. Schofield, after the battle, ordered a withdrawal to Nashville, with the bridges now repaired. For the next day, Hood planned another assault, this time with the cover of 100 cannons. Their commanders were obviously disgusted by the news of another assault the following morning. Luckily for the Confederates, Schofield was long gone by the time they awoke the next day. The following day, Hood ordered a collection of the wounded. He ordered graves dug and a collection of food, weapons, and clothing to be collected and given to the quartermaster for distribution. Confederates, the way they would get supplies is usually through a battle. So after a battle was just a big frenzy of looting for boots, shoes, jackets. I think the way Confederate uniforms later in the war were made for the Army of Tennessee was like taking a blue coat off, and then you throw it into a pot and you boil it and you throw some other stuff in it and turn it gray. So, I mean, they really had nothing. So they would love just looting battlefields because then they get anything they wanted. Hood held the field after the Battle of Franklin, technically in the rules of war for making him the victor, but he and his commanders knew that he lost badly. Hood knew if he retreated and acknowledged that he had been defeated, the Army of Tennessee would just vanish before his eyes. So Hood decided to press forward. Hood needed a win. He decided to flood into Nashville and try to somehow defeat the Union Army. Hood marched to Nashville, and poor weather caused both sides to hunker down. He ordered his men to dig trenches, which he was ironically against at first, believing them to be cowardly. 2 weeks would go by, and his men would huddle in the cold, watching the light and smoke of the homes of Nashville as they were ordered to dig trenches. Some of the luckier soldiers in Tennessee were able to go home during this intermission. Others, who had family in Nashville, just had to simply watch the city's warm glow. Thomas prepared his army during the snow and ice storm as well. Grant was on Thomas's case, ordering him to attack constantly, even though the ice prevented large-scale movements. But there was still skirmishing between Hood and Thomas, with sharpshooting and shelling being the norm. Hood ordered his cannons not to return fire to preserve ammunition. Elements of Hood's cavalry was able to capture 2 Union gunboats 12 miles south of Nashville. Forrest was sent north to cut the Chattanooga Railroad, but inevitably failed. On December 14th, the ice melted, and Thomas planned his attack, tired of the heckling from Grant. Thomas planned to swing in like a wheel, defeating Hood and driving him from his trenches by using the superiority in numbers to outflank him. Hood was unaware of Thomas's plan of attack, and during the intermission, Hood sent letters all across the Confederacy looking for reinforcements, thinking that he was just going to sit out Nashville all winter, gather more men, and attack in the spring. Hood intended to wait for Thomas to attack him, have Thomas grind against Hood's trenches, like the Union did to him at Franklin. Thomas planned to have a feint attack on Hood's right that was anchored on the west side on the deep cut of the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad. This was around 7,500 men in total, and that was mostly made up of 2 African-American regiments. Thomas planned an attack on dawn, but was delayed, and the attack started around 8. Fog on the morning of the 15th covered the Union forces on Hood's left, and the attack failed miserably, with close-range gunfire and artillery support driving the Union forces back. Hood's fortifications on the left should have held off any attack, but they were unfinished by the time Thomas attacked around 10 a.m. Sustained Union artillery fire covered the Union advance, with Wilson's cavalry defeating the Confederate cavalry early on. Thomas had complete supremacy, with his men overwhelming Hood's small army, taking the left flank and forcing Hood to retreat. Hood's reserve kept the retreat from turning into a rout. Hood moved his men a couple miles south and reformed on a new ridge. Hood set his men up in a U formation, with his reserve holding the flanks. Hood ordered his tired men to dig trenches, but they were rushed. The defenses looked formidable, but were exposed to Union artillery fire. Finally, the trenches were on a slope. Union soldiers could hide under the slope. Thomas, on the afternoon of the 16th, decided that he would try the same plan again, moving in a wheel. Thomas once again hit Hood's right on Peach Orchard, but by this time with more Union troops. This attack failed once again, with close-range artillery fire, throwing the troops back. Hood sent troops to defend the peach orchard, thinning his lines on Sky Hill, which would be a pressure point in Hood's line. Brigadier General John MacArthur noticed the heavy artillery pounding Sky Hill and noticed that if he attacked, the whole defensive line would fall down. MacArthur attacked in force, breaking the line and breaking Hood's army. Hood would then withdraw, with Forrest returning just in time to cover Hood's retreat, preventing Thomas from eliminating Hood's entire army. Hood would bring his army to Mississippi and resign his command, leaving the war a failure. To answer the question whether Hood is an example of the Peter Principle, I want to close with a quote from Napoleon about Marshal Ney. Ney could only command around 10,000 men, nothing more than that. He was out of his depth.